The map room fell silent. It was the morning of September 4th, 1944, and Generalleutnant Hans von Obstfelder stood motionless before the tactical display at 5th Panzer Army headquarters in Nancy, France. His finger traced a line across the map, a line that shouldn't exist. In just 26 days, American forces had advanced from the beaches of Normandy to the very threshold of the German frontier. The red markings showed enemy positions that, by every calculation of logistics, fuel consumption, and operational tempo his staff had made, should still be hundreds of kilometers to the west. "This is impossible," he said quietly, though everyone in the room had already reached the same conclusion. Third Army, Patton's Third Army, had moved 600 miles in less than a month. Von Obstfelder had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front. He knew what rapid advances looked like. He had participated in Case Blue, the Wehrmacht's massive 1942 summer offensive toward the Caucasus. That operation, hailed as a masterpiece of mobile warfare, had covered roughly 400 miles in 3 months, with the full weight of Army Group South behind it. Patton had just exceeded that pace with a single-field army, across terrain the Germans themselves had deliberately devastated during their retreat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The numbers made no sense. Von Obstfelder's intelligence section had calculated fuel requirements based on standard operational parameters. A mechanized division consumed approximately 30,000 gallons of gasoline per day during sustained operations. Third Army fielded 12 divisions, plus Corps and Army-level support units. That meant roughly 400,000 gallons daily, minimum. The destruction of Cherbourg's port facilities should have strangled any such advance. The Allied supply line stretched back almost 300 miles to the Normandy beaches, over roads the Luftwaffe had been assured were under constant interdiction. Yet here they were. The Americans hadn't paused. They hadn't consolidated. They hadn't done any of the things German operational doctrine said they must do. Von Obstfelder had joined the German General Staff in 1933, in the early days of rearmament. He had studied under some of the finest military minds in Europe, men who had refined the principles of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, to a science. The math was elegant and unforgiving. An army advanced at the speed of its slowest supply column. Logistics determined everything. No force could outrun its fuel trucks, its ammunition convoys, its food supplies. This wasn't theory or doctrine. It was physics. The German General Staff had built the entire structure of Blitzkrieg around these calculations. Strike fast, penetrate deep, but always, always maintain the tether to your supply base. The greatest German advances of the war had all followed this pattern. Poland in 1939. Massive initial breakthrough, then a pause to allow logistics to catch up. France in 1940. Spectacular armored thrusts, followed by careful consolidation phases. Even Barbarossa, for all its initial success, had ground to a halt outside Moscow, when the panzers finally outran their supply lines. The Americans appeared to operate under different physical laws. Von Obstfelder pulled the latest intelligence summary from the stack of documents on the table. Third Army had liberated Chartres on August 18th, less than 3 weeks earlier. That was 85 kilometers southwest of Paris. Now forward elements were approaching Metz, 330 kilometers to the east. His staff had marked every major town Third Army had seized: Orléans, Troyes, Châlons-en-Champagne, Verdun. The red line swept across France like a scythe. But it was the attached logistical assessment that truly disturbed him. German aerial reconnaissance, what little remained of it, had photographed the American supply routes. The images showed an unbroken stream of vehicles stretching back toward the coast. Trucks moved in both directions, day and night, in columns so long that observers couldn't see where they ended. The photographic interpreters had counted vehicles and made estimates. Third Army's supply line, they calculated, consisted of approximately 6,000 trucks operating in a continuous cycle. 6,000 trucks. The entire Wehrmacht in the West now fielded perhaps 4,000 operational vehicles of all types, and many of those were horse-drawn wagons, pressed into service as German motor pools disintegrated under Allied air attack. Colonel Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte, a Fallschirmjäger officer who had recently joined von Obstfelder's staff after the destruction of his paratrooper regiment in Normandy, studied the map with hollow eyes. "They don't stop," he said. "We blow a bridge. They have it repaired in hours. We crater a road. It's filled by morning. We hit a supply column. Another appears to replace it." He paused. "It's not that they fight differently than we do, Herr General. It's that they operate on a different scale. They have so much of everything that our interdiction doesn't matter." Von der Heydte had fought in Crete, in North Africa, in Russia. He had seen German logistics at their finest, the careful orchestration of supplies that had enabled Rommel's advances across the desert, the massive preparations that had preceded Operation Citadel at Kursk. He understood how much staff work, how much calculation, how much sheer effort went into keeping an army moving. What the Americans were doing shouldn't be possible. The doctrine was clear. After a major breakthrough, an attacking force needed time to reorganize, to bring forward supplies, to rest exhausted troops, to repair vehicles, to integrate replacements. This was the natural rhythm of warfare, observed by every army since Napoleon. The pursuit phase following a breakthrough typically lasted a few days, perhaps a week at most, before exhaustion and supply difficulties forced an operational pause. Patton's Third Army had been in continuous pursuit for 26 days. Von Obstfelder turned to his operations officer, Major Klaus von Reinhardt. "What is their average daily advance?" Von Reinhardt consulted his notes. "Since the breakout at Avranches on July 30th, Third Army has advanced approximately 600 miles. That's an average of 23 miles per day, sustained over nearly 5 weeks." He looked up. "But that understates it, Herr General. They've been accelerating. In the last week alone, some of their armored columns have covered more than 40 miles in a single day." 40 miles. Von Obstfelder had participated in the planning for the Battle of France in 1940, serving on the staff of General Heinz Guderian. That campaign, considered the apotheosis of German mobile warfare, had averaged 12 miles per day across its entire duration. The Wehrmacht's advance into France had been a masterpiece precisely because it had maintained that tempo while keeping its logistics functioning. The Americans were moving twice as fast, across much longer distances, and they weren't slowing down. "Show me their fuel consumption again," von Obstfelder said. Von Reinhardt pulled out another document, this one compiled from interrogations of captured American soldiers and analysis of abandoned supply dumps. Each of their armored divisions operates approximately 300 tanks and armored vehicles. The M4 Sherman tank consumes roughly 150 gallons per 100 miles of road march. Their tank destroyers, half-tracks, and support vehicles have similar fuel requirements. A single armored division in sustained operations requires approximately 60,000 gallons per day. He continued. Third Army currently fields 4 armored divisions and 8 infantry divisions. The infantry divisions are motorized. Every unit moves by truck or half-track. Based on captured supply documents, we estimate their total daily fuel requirement at approximately 450,000 gallons. Von Obstfelder did the math in his head. 450,000 gallons per day, sustained for 36 days since the breakout. That was over 16 million gallons of fuel. Where is it coming from? The ports, Herr General. We demolished Cherbourg's facilities thoroughly. American engineers had it partially operational in 3 weeks. They're unloading approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day through Cherbourg alone, plus another 30,000 tons per day over the beaches. And they're laying fuel pipelines, actual pipelines, Herr General, from the coast to forward supply dumps. Pipelines. Von Obstfelder had heard the reports, but hadn't fully believed them. The Americans were constructing fuel pipelines across France, threading them through the very territory their armies had just conquered. The engineering effort alone would have required most German armies to halt operations for weeks. The Americans were doing it simultaneously with their advance. Major Werner von Schell, the intelligence officer, added another detail. We've identified the pipeline construction units from captured documents. They're called Engineer Petroleum Distribution Companies. Each company can lay approximately 40 miles of pipeline per week. Third Army has at least 6 of these companies working behind their advance. 6 companies laying 40 miles of pipeline per week meant roughly 240 miles of new fuel infrastructure every 7 days. Von Obstfelder tried to imagine German engineers accomplishing anything similar during the advance into Russia. It would have required stripping the entire eastern front of engineering assets. What about their maintenance capabilities? Von Obstfelder asked. Vehicle breakdowns should be crippling in advance of this speed. The Americans were driving their trucks and tanks across terrible roads, through mud and dust, at punishing speeds. Even the most reliable vehicles needed constant maintenance. Von Reinhardt had an answer ready. They have mobile maintenance battalions that travel directly behind the combat formations. Captured documents describe something called fourth echelon maintenance. Specialized heavy repair units that can rebuild engines, replace transmissions, and perform major overhauls without sending vehicles to the rear. They carry complete workshops on trucks. Von Obstfelder absorbed this. German maintenance doctrine required damaged vehicles to be sent back to rear area facilities, often hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. The round trip could take weeks. The Americans brought the repair shops forward, keeping damaged vehicles close to the fighting and returning them to service in days rather than weeks. Every detail revealed the same pattern. The Americans had built an entire system, an entire philosophy of warfare, around the assumption that logistics could keep pace with combat operations. They didn't see supply lines as a constraint to be managed, but as a problem to be solved with overwhelming industrial capacity. Colonel Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, had been summoned to headquarters to brief on his division's recent encounters with American armor. He stood now at the map, pointing to positions near Commercy. "We ambushed one of their armored columns here on September 1st, he said. "My Tigers destroyed 7 of their Sherman tanks in the opening salvo. It was a perfect tactical engagement. We had the high ground, good fields of fire, complete surprise." He paused. 3 hours later, the Americans came back with 18 tanks. Not repaired tanks, Herr. General, new tanks. They'd brought up an entire reserve platoon from somewhere behind their lines. We destroyed 4 more before withdrawing. The next morning, they attacked again with a full company. They simply replaced their losses faster than we could inflict them. Von Luttwitz had fought in Russia, in North Africa, in Italy. He understood the mathematics of attrition. A defender with good positions and superior weapons could inflict losses far exceeding his own casualties. This was fundamental to German defensive doctrine in the current phase of the war. Make the enemy pay for every mile, bleed their tank strength, force them to pause and rebuild. But how did you bleed an enemy who could replace losses overnight? Their tank production, von Obstfelder said. It wasn't a question, but von Reinhardt answered anyway. Our latest intelligence estimate, based on diplomatic sources in neutral countries and analysis of American industrial journals, suggests they're producing approximately 2,000 tanks per month. That's for all types: Sherman mediums, tank destroyers, light tanks. He let that number settle. The Americans appear to have more tanks in their supply pipeline than we have on the entire Western Front. 2,000 tanks per month. The German tank production, what remained of it after years of Allied bombing, now struggled to produce 500 vehicles per month for all fronts combined, and that included assault guns, tank destroyers, every type of armored vehicle the Wehrmacht fielded. The Americans were building tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them, much faster. Von Obstfelder returned to the original map, to that impossible red line stretching across France. 26 days, 600 miles. He thought about the logistics manuals he'd studied, the careful calculations of supply tonnages and road capacities, the elegant theories of operational art that had defined German military excellence for generations. All of it had assumed one fundamental truth, that both sides operated under the same constraints, that armies moved at roughly similar speeds, consumed roughly similar amounts of supplies, faced roughly similar logistical limitations. German military planning had refined itself against enemies who played by these same rules: the French, the Poles, the Soviets, even the British. The Americans didn't play by these rules. They'd written new rules, rules based on industrial capacity so vast that it rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. Von Obstfelder had seen the intelligence briefings on American industrial production. He'd read them, filed them, and largely dismissed them as exaggerations or propaganda designed to demoralize German troops. The numbers were simply too large to be credible. One report claimed the Americans produced more steel in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. Another suggested their automotive industry churned out military trucks at a rate of 40,000 per month. 40,000 trucks per month. The figure seemed absurd. Yet here was Third Army, supplied by an endless convoy of vehicles that never seemed to diminish no matter how many German fighters strafed them or how many bridges the Wehrmacht demolished. Major von Schell spread a series of reconnaissance photographs across the table. These were taken by one of our few remaining long-range reconnaissance aircraft over the American rear areas 3 days ago. The images showed vast staging areas, enormous supply dumps, and vehicle parks stretching to the horizon. We estimate this single depot near Chartres contains approximately 50,000 tons of supplies. We've identified at least 8 similar depots between the coast and Third Army's current positions. 50,000 tons, von Obstfelder calculated quickly. That was enough supplies to sustain Third Army for 3 days of intense combat operations. And there were 8 such depots. The Americans had positioned almost enough material in pre-stocked supply dumps to support 2 weeks of fighting without any additional shipments from the coast. This level of logistical preparation was unprecedented. The German army had never been able to accumulate such reserves, not even during the carefully planned offensives of 1940. Every major Wehrmacht operation had been preceded by weeks or months of painstaking supply accumulation, drawing down stockpiles across the entire theater. And even then, German forces had often been forced to pause after initial successes while logistics caught up. The Americans had built supply depots faster than their armies could consume them. "What are the fuel stocks?" von Obstfelder asked. "Each depot includes fuel storage for approximately 3 million gallons, von Schell replied. "The Americans use prefabricated rubber bladders that can be deployed in hours. They arrive collapsed on trucks, get filled from the pipelines or tanker convoys, and can supply an entire armored division for a week." Von Obstfelder tried to visualize 3 million gallons of fuel. The entire fuel allocation for Army Group G, defending southern France, amounted to perhaps 5 million gallons per month, and that had to be carefully rationed across all units. The Americans had that much fuel sitting in rubber bags at a single supply dump, and they had 8 such dumps currently identified. The disparity wasn't merely numerical. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two militaries conceptualized warfare itself. German operational planning began with careful calculations of available resources. Staff officers determined how much fuel existed, how many shells had been stockpiled, how much food could be transported. These figures then determined what operations were possible. An offensive could advance this far, attack for this many days, employ this many divisions. Logistics defined the boundaries of operational possibility. The Americans seemed to work
backward. They decided what operational objectives they wanted to achieve, then built the logistics system required to support those objectives. If an advance required 500,000 gallons of fuel per day, they found a way to deliver 500,000 gallons per day. If that meant constructing pipelines across hundreds of miles of French countryside while simultaneously fighting, they constructed pipelines. If it meant operating 6,000 supply trucks in continuous rotation, they operated 6,000 trucks. The German General Staff had always prided itself on operational brilliance, the ability to achieve maximum results with limited resources through superior planning and execution. This was the essence of German military excellence, forged through centuries of warfare as a smaller power facing larger enemies. But what happened when one side had effectively unlimited resources? Colonel von der Heydte broke the silence. "We cannot stop them with conventional methods, Herr General. We destroy a bridge. They ford the river with amphibious vehicles, or construct a new bridge overnight. We establish a defensive position. They call in artillery bombardments that expend more shells in an hour than we receive in a month. We counterattack with our last armor reserves. They absorb the casualties and counterattack with fresh divisions we didn't know existed." He gestured at the map. "Every engagement follows the same pattern. We achieve local tactical successes, sometimes inflict favorable loss ratios, then watch as the Americans simply replace their losses and continue the advance. It's not that their soldiers are better than ours, or that their tactics are superior. It's that they have so much of everything that our tactical victories are operationally meaningless." Von Obstfelder had reached the same conclusion, though hearing it stated so bluntly was still jarring. The Wehrmacht in the West was fighting a 19th century war, concerned with protecting supply lines, hoarding precious resources, carefully positioning limited forces to maximum effect. The Americans were fighting a 20th century industrial war, where material abundance made traditional operational constraints irrelevant. The telephone on von Obstfelder's desk rang. His aide answered, listened briefly, then covered the mouthpiece. "Herr General, it's Field Marshal von Rundstedt. He wants your assessment of Third Army's offensive capabilities over the next 2 weeks." Von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, technically von Obstfelder's superior, though the chain of command had become chaotic as the front disintegrated. Von Obstfelder took the phone. "Herr Feldmarschall, my assessment is that Third Army will continue its current operational tempo unless forcibly halted. We lack the forces to halt them." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They are not constrained by logistics as we understand them. Their fuel supplies appear inexhaustible. Their replacement flow of men and equipment exceeds their combat losses.
Every projection we make based on standard operational parameters proves incorrect. Von Rundstedt's voice came through the line, tired and bitter. Then tell me what they will do, not what they cannot do. Von Obstfelder looked at the map. Third Army's forward elements are approaching Metz and Nancy. Once they secure crossings over the Moselle River, nothing prevents them from advancing to the Rhine. That's another 150 kilometers. At their current pace, they could reach the German border in less than 2 weeks. There was silence on the line. Then, can we hold the Moselle? We have the First Army's remnants and whatever fortress troops are garrisoned in Metz. Perhaps 40,000 men, mostly administrative and rear echelon personnel. Few heavy weapons, almost no armor, limited ammunition. Third Army fields, approximately 300,000 men organized in 12 full-strength divisions with complete artillery and armor support. Von Obstfelder paused. No, Herr Feldmarschall, we cannot hold the Moselle. Von Rundstedt said something unprintable, then hung up. The room remained silent. Everyone present understood what von Obstfelder had just confirmed. The Western Front had ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. German forces in France were now simply scattered groups of survivors conducting delaying actions while the Americans advanced wherever and whenever they chose. Major von Reinhardt spoke quietly. The Führer's orders are to hold Metz at all costs. It's classified as a fortress city. The garrison is forbidden to retreat. Von Obstfelder said nothing. He had received the same orders. He had also received intelligence reports indicating that Third Army's 4 armored divisions were concentrating for a major assault on Metz. The city would fall in days, perhaps hours. The garrison would be destroyed or captured. And for what? To delay the American advance by 3 days? 4? The mathematics of attrition that had sustained German defensive operations in Russia no longer functioned in the West. In the East, the Wehrmacht could trade space for time, falling back hundreds of miles to stretch Soviet supply lines, while German logistics shortened. Destroyed German divisions could be partially rebuilt with replacement drafts. Lost equipment could be replaced from factories still operating in the Reich proper. None of this worked against an enemy who moved faster than you could retreat, who supplied armies across distances that should have been prohibitive, and who replaced losses faster than you could inflict them. Colonel von Luttwitz raised another issue. What concerns me most isn't what Third Army has done, but what it represents. Patton's force is one of several American field armies now in France. First Army is fighting near the German border in the north. Seventh Army is driving up from the Mediterranean. If they all operate with similar logistics, capabilities, he didn't need to finish. If every American army could sustain Patton's operational tempo, the Germans faced not one unstoppable offensive, but 3 or 4 simultaneous advances, each supplied well enough to maintain continuous pressure. The traditional German defensive strategy of shifting reserves to threatened sectors, plugging gaps and stabilizing the line became impossible when the enemy attacked everywhere at once with forces too powerful to be contained. Von Obstfelder walked to the window. Outside, the September morning looked deceptively peaceful. Nancy had not yet come under direct attack, though American reconnaissance patrols had been spotted within 10 kilometers of the city. The civilian population was beginning to evacuate, clogging the roads east with refugees. German military police were trying to keep the roads clear for military traffic, but it was futile. Everything was breaking down. He thought about his career, the decades of professional military service. He had studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great, Napoleon, Moltke. He had absorbed the lessons of the First World War: mobility, firepower, combined arms coordination. He had participated in the development of modern armored warfare doctrine in the 1930s. He had commanded troops in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood warfare as well as any officer in the Wehrmacht. None of it had prepared him for this. The door opened, and a young lieutenant entered with another stack of reports. Von Obstfelder returned to the table and began reading. The reports were from various units along what remained of the front line. Each told essentially the same story. The 316th Infantry Division reported engaging American forces near Verdun. The division, actually a reinforced regiment with fewer than 4,000 men, had established defensive positions along the Meuse River. American forces had probed the defenses for 6 hours, then called in an artillery barrage that the division commander described as unprecedented in intensity. The Americans had fired an estimated 5,000 shells in 30 minutes. The 316th Infantry Division had ceased to exist as a combat formation. Survivors were retreating toward Metz in small groups. 5,000 shells in 30 minutes. Von Obstfelder calculated the tonnage. Each American 105 millimeter howitzer shell weighed approximately 35 pounds. 5,000 shells meant roughly 75 tons of high explosive delivered onto a single division's positions in half an hour. The entire artillery ammunition allocation for Army Group G for a month was approximately 10,000 tons, and that had to serve every division, every gun, across hundreds of miles of front. The Americans had expended a month's worth of German artillery ammunition, proportionally speaking, in a 30-minute barrage against a single division. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Another report described an American supply convoy spotted by a reconnaissance patrol. The observer estimated the convoy contained more than 400 vehicles, stretching along the road for over 8 kilometers. The vehicles were transporting fuel, ammunition, and rations forward to Third Army's advancing spearheads. The patrol had called for air support to attack the convoy. No aircraft were available. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed over the summer, shot down by American fighters or destroyed on the ground by American bombers. What few German aircraft remained were held back for defense of the Reich itself. The patrol could only watch as 400 supply trucks drove past, unmolested, carrying enough supplies to sustain an American division for a week. Von Obstfelder found the report from General Lieutenant Otto von Knobelsdorff, commander of First Army, whose forces were supposed to be defending the approaches to Metz. Von Knobelsdorff's assessment was brutal in its honesty. We face an enemy who appears to have solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare: how to keep mobile forces supplied during rapid advances across long distances. Our counterattacks fail not because of tactical errors, but because we cannot concentrate sufficient forces before the Americans detect our movements and strike our assembly areas with overwhelming air power. Our defensive positions are bypassed before we can properly prepare them. Our supply lines are interdicted while American supply lines operate unmolested. We are attempting to fight a modern mechanized war with the resources and capabilities of a 19th century army. The next document was an intercepted American radio transmission decoded by German signals intelligence. It was mundane. A logistics coordinator reporting supply deliveries to a forward headquarters. But the content was staggering. The transmission listed deliveries for a single day to a single American division. 300 tons of ammunition, 140,000 gallons of fuel, 90 tons of rations, 40 tons of engineering supplies, and 25 tons of medical supplies. Von Obstfelder added the figures. 555 tons of supplies delivered to one division in one day. That was more than entire German corps received in a week. Major von Schell had been compiling similar data for weeks, trying to construct an accurate picture of American logistics capabilities. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook filled with calculations. Herr General, I've been tracking Third Army's supply consumption based on captured documents and our observations. The numbers are consistent and verifiable. He flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting. Third Army's 12 divisions require approximately 15,000 tons of supplies per day to sustain full combat operations. That includes fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and spare parts. Over the past 36 days, they've consumed roughly 540,000 tons of material. Von Obstfelder considered this. 540,000 tons. The entire German logistics effort in the West, for all armies, all formations, currently moved perhaps 30,000 tons per day, and much of that was devoted simply to moving troops and equipment away from the advancing Allies rather than sustaining combat operations. How are they moving it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Motor transport primarily, von Schell replied. We've identified their system through captured documents. They call it the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck route running from the Normandy ports to forward supply dumps. The route operates under strict traffic control. Trucks move in one direction on designated roads, return empty on parallel roads, no civilian traffic permitted. Military police at every intersection ensuring continuous flow. He consulted his notes. Based on aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports, approximately 5,500 trucks operate on the Red Ball Express at any given time. Each truck carries 5 tons of cargo. They complete the round trip, roughly 600 miles, in approximately 3 days. That gives them a sustained delivery capacity of roughly 9,000 tons per day, just from this one dedicated supply route. 9,000 tons per day from a single truck convoy system. The Americans had created a logistics operation larger than most German armies' entire supply apparatus and devoted it exclusively to feeding Patton's advance. They have other supply routes as well, von Schell continued. Smaller dedicated convoys supplying First Army and Seventh Army, rail lines being restored behind their advance. And the pipeline system I mentioned earlier, they're laying both fuel and water pipelines as their armies advance. Water pipelines. Von Obstfelder hadn't even considered water supply. German armies relied on local sources, wells and rivers, occasionally supplemented by water purification units. The Americans were building dedicated infrastructure to supply drinking water to their forces, as if the basic necessities of life were simply another engineering problem to be solved with industrial capacity. Colonel von der Heydte returned to an earlier point. It's not merely the quantity of supplies, Herr General. It's the variety and quality. We captured an American supply depot last month during a counterattack near Mortain. The depot contained items I'd never seen in German logistics. Pre-packaged meals that required no cooking, portable generators, complete medical facilities in trucks, spare parts organized by equipment type with detailed inventory lists, even recreational supplies, sports equipment, writing paper, cigarettes. He shook his head at the memory. The food. Stocks alone were remarkable. We found fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, not preserved or canned, fresh. The Americans were supplying fresh food to front-line units. Our men were living on black bread and ersatz coffee when we had even that. The Americans were eating better than German civilians in the Reich. This was another dimension of the supply disparity that von Obstfelder found difficult to comprehend. The Wehrmacht had been on reduced rations since 1942. German soldiers in the field received adequate calories, usually, but the diet was monotonous and often unhealthy. Fresh food was rare, variety was non-existent, vitamin deficiencies were common. The standard German field ration consisted of hard bread, canned meat or fish, some form of spread or cheese, and coffee substitute made from roasted grains. The Americans supplied their troops as if they were still in America, with nearly the same variety and quality of food available to civilians at home. This wasn't military efficiency. This was abundance so extreme it redefined what military logistics could accomplish. Von Obstfelder returned to the immediate tactical situation. What is Third Army's current disposition? Major von Reinhardt updated the map with the latest intelligence. 13 Corps has reached the Moselle River south of Metz. Chesina Corps is approaching Nancy. 8 Corps is conducting screening operations on the southern flank. IV Armored Division is leading the advance toward Metz, with 6th Armored Division close behind. Their 80th Infantry Division has secured bridgeheads across the Meuse. He marked enemy positions with red pins. Each pin represented thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces by the dozen. They're positioning for a major offensive against Metz and Nancy simultaneously. We estimate the assault will begin within 72 hours. They're accumulating supplies at forward depots now. We've observed significant truck traffic into areas just behind their current positions. Von Obstfelder studied the map. The American positions formed a vast arc stretching from Luxembourg in the north to the Vosges Mountains in the south. Third Army's spearheads had pushed so far east that their flanks were dangerously exposed, or would have been if the Germans possessed any significant mobile reserves to exploit those flanks. But the Wehrmacht in the west had no such reserves. Every available unit was committed to trying to slow the American advance. There were no panzers waiting for the perfect moment to strike. There were no fresh divisions held back for counterattacks. The Americans could expose their flanks with impunity because the Germans lacked the strength to threaten them. What about their air support? Von Obstfelder asked. Colonel von Lüttwitz, who had experienced American air power firsthand, answered. Total dominance, Herr General. The Americans own the sky. We've observed their fighter-bombers operating in groups of 12 to 20 aircraft, attacking any German movement they detect. They fly low-level missions along the roads, destroying vehicles, supply columns, anything that moves. Their pilots appear to have unlimited ammunition and fuel. They loiter over target areas for hours. He pointed to several locations on the map. We attempted to move my division's repair echelon from here to here, a distance of 40 kilometers, 3 nights ago. American night fighters detected the movement. We lost 23 vehicles, including several irreplaceable repair trucks. This was at night, Herr General. They have aircraft equipped to hunt vehicles in complete darkness. Von Obstfelder had read reports of American aircraft equipped with radar systems that could detect ground vehicles at night. The technology seemed almost fantastical, yet the evidence was undeniable. German forces had learned to move only at night to avoid Allied air attack, so the Americans had developed the capability to attack at night as well. Every adaptation the Wehrmacht made, the Americans countered with some new technology or capability. It was like fighting an enemy who could read your mind and possessed unlimited resources to respond to whatever strategy you employed. The telephone rang again. Von Obstfelder's aide answered, spoke briefly, then looked up with concern. Herr General, OB West reports that American reconnaissance elements have been spotted within 5 kilometers of Nancy. They're requesting immediate evacuation of headquarters. The room fell silent. 5 kilometers. The Americans were almost at the gates. Von Obstfelder looked around at his staff officers, these men who had served with him through years of war. They were professionals, well-trained, experienced. They understood their craft. Under normal circumstances, fighting an enemy bound by the same logistical constraints, operating under similar resource limitations. They would have been formidable opponents. But these were not normal circumstances. "Begin evacuation procedures," von Obstfelder ordered. "All essential documents and equipment to be loaded within 2 hours. We relocate to Saarbrücken." He turned to von Reinhardt. "Orders to all subordinate units. Continue delaying actions but avoid decisive engagements. Preserve forces where possible. Fall back to the West Wall fortifications." The West Wall, the Siegfried Line, as the Allies called it. Germany's pre-war defensive fortifications along the western border, neglected for years while the Wehrmacht fought offensive wars across Europe. Now it was the last line of defense before the Reich itself. If the Americans broke through there, nothing stood between them and the industrial heart of Germany. As his staff began organizing the evacuation, von Obstfelder permitted himself one final look at the map. That red line stretching across France told a story that would be studied for generations, not as a tale of tactical brilliance or operational genius, but as the moment when industrial capacity fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. The German General Staff had spent decades perfecting the art of war. They had created doctrines for mobile warfare that were studied worldwide. They had demonstrated in Poland and France that superior training, planning, and execution could overcome numerical disadvantages. They had built a military machine designed to achieve maximum results with limited resources. All of that excellence now meant nothing against an enemy who had solved the fundamental problem that had constrained military operations throughout history. They had made logistics abundant enough to be irrelevant as an operational constraint. Von Obstfelder gathered his personal papers and prepared to leave. Outside, he could hear the sounds of headquarters preparing for evacuation, trucks being loaded, documents being burned, staff officers shouting orders. The same scene was playing out across what remained of German-occupied France: retreat, evacuation, delaying actions. The proud Wehrmacht reduced to simply running away as fast as possible, hoping to reach the German border before the Americans caught them. He thought about the young officers who would study this campaign in future military academies, assuming Germany survived to have military academies. They would analyze Patton's advance, the logistics that sustained it, the operational tempo that made it possible. They would learn that warfare in the industrial age was no longer decided primarily by tactical skill or operational brilliance, but by productive capacity, by which side could build more trucks, produce more fuel, manufacture more ammunition. The Americans had understood this truth before the war began. They had built their entire military strategy around it. While Germany had focused on creating the most tactically proficient army in the world, America had focused on creating the industrial base to supply that army indefinitely. The Wehrmacht had trained better soldiers. America had built more trucks. In the end, the trucks had won. A young lieutenant appeared at the door. "Herr General, your vehicle is ready. We should leave immediately. American artillery observers have been spotted on the hills west of the city." Von Obstfelder took one last look at the map room, at the charts and displays that showed the disintegration of German power in the west. Then he picked up his cap and walked toward the door. Behind him, staff officers were already removing maps from the walls, packing radios into crates, destroying documents too sensitive to transport. Within hours, this headquarters would cease to exist. Third Army would roll through Nancy, barely pausing, and continue its advance toward the German frontier. The campaign that had begun at Normandy's beaches on the 6th of June was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Germany's western defenses had not been defeated in some dramatic climactic battle. They had simply been overwhelmed by an enemy who possessed resources so vast that resistance was mathematically futile. Von Obstfelder stepped outside into the morning sunlight. To the west, He could hear the distant rumble of artillery. American artillery, almost certainly, given that German guns had largely fallen silent for lack of ammunition. The sound was constant, a low thunder that never quite faded. The Americans were preparing the battlefield for their next advance, softening defenses, destroying fortifications, making ready for another leap forward. How long until they reached the Rhine? Weeks? Days? He climbed into the staff car and gave the order to proceed. As they drove east through Nancy's streets, he saw French civilians watching the German evacuation with carefully neutral expressions. They knew what was coming. The Americans would be here soon, probably within hours. The civilians would welcome them, or at least not resist them. Why would they? The Americans brought food, medicine, order. The Germans brought only retreat and destruction. The car passed a column of German infantry marching east. They looked exhausted, filthy, defeated. These were men from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, supposedly an elite formation. Now they marched on foot because they lacked vehicles, carrying what supplies they could on their backs, leaving behind wounded and equipment they couldn't transport. They didn't look like soldiers of the vaunted Wehrmacht. They looked like refugees. Von Obstfelder closed his eyes and tried to rest. He knew what came next. The Americans would pause at the German border, not from exhaustion or supply difficulties, but because their strategic planning called for a pause. They would consolidate their positions, bring forward supplies, prepare for the final push into Germany itself. That pause would be brief, perhaps a few weeks. Then they would advance again, with the same overwhelming force, the same inexhaustible supplies, the same unstoppable momentum. And when they crossed into Germany, they would find a nation already broken by years of war, bombed cities, failing infrastructure, a population near starvation. The war was effectively over. Only the dying remained. The delegation departed Seattle on October 23, 1938, boarding a train that would carry them east across the American continent. Schneider sat by the window as the industrial outskirts of Seattle gave way to the forested mountains of the Cascade Range. He had drafted his preliminary report during the journey, filling page after page with technical observations, production statistics, and strategic assessments. But the document felt inadequate. How could he convey the psychological impact of what they had witnessed? How could mere numbers capture the moment when he realized that German aviation industry, for all its sophistication and technical excellence, operated on a fundamentally different scale than American manufacturing capacity? The train crossed into Montana, rolling through vast expanses of empty land, wheat fields stretching to the horizon, cattle ranches larger than German provinces, forests that seemed to extend forever. America's geography itself was a strategic asset. The factories they had visited sat thousands of miles from any potential enemy, protected by oceans that no bomber could cross, no army could threaten. Germany's industrial centers, by contrast, clustered in the Ruhr Valley and other regions that would be vulnerable to enemy attack from the first day of any future war. The Americans could build their weapons in absolute safety, testing them at leisure, training their crews without fear of interruption. In Chicago, the delegation stopped for 3 days to visit Douglas Aircraft's facilities and tour several automotive plants. The pattern repeated itself. At Douglas, they watched A-20 attack bombers take shape on assembly lines that mirrored Boeing's approach. At Ford's massive River Rouge complex, they witnessed industrial organization on a scale that defied comprehension. The Rouge plant produced its own steel from raw iron ore, manufactured its own glass, generated its own electricity, and assembled complete automobiles at a rate of 1 vehicle every 49 seconds. Thousands of workers flowed in and out with each shift change. Rail cars delivered materials in constant streams. Finished automobiles departed in unending convoys. Captain Hoffman stood on an observation platform overlooking the Rouge assembly floor, watching Model A Fords emerge from the production line with mechanical regularity. "This is what they will turn against us," he said to Schneider. "Not just the aircraft factories, all of it. Every automotive plant, every steel mill, every machine shop. America builds 15 million automobiles every year. Germany builds perhaps 200,000. Do you understand what that disparity means? It means they have the tooling, the workers, the organizational systems, the supply chains, everything necessary to produce weapons at volumes we cannot imagine. They visited Chrysler, where tank prototypes were being developed. They toured machine tool manufacturers whose products equipped factories across the country. They saw railroad yards where freight trains stretched for miles, carrying raw materials and finished goods in endless circulation. Everywhere they looked, they found abundance, efficiency, and scale. American industrial capacity wasn't just larger than Germany's. It was differently organized, built on principles of mass production that transformed manufacturing from a limited craft into an unlimited process. The delegation reached New York in early November. Their official program included meetings with aviation executives and tours of additional manufacturing facilities, but Schneider found himself distracted by the city itself. New York's skyline spoke of wealth beyond calculation, skyscrapers that dwarfed European, cathedrals built not for kings or churches but for commerce. The streets teemed with automobiles, far more than he had seen in Berlin or Munich. Electric lights blazed from every building. The shops overflowed with consumer goods, their windows displaying abundance that would have seemed obscene in Germany's carefully managed economy. One evening, Schneider walked alone through Times Square, surrounded by the chaotic energy of American capitalism. Neon signs advertised everything from cigarettes to motion pictures. Newsboys hawked papers with headlines about European tensions, Hitler's demands on Czechoslovakia, Britain's appeasement efforts, France's military preparations. Americans hurried past, intent on their own concerns, barely aware that their country's industrial might had become the decisive factor in the gathering storm across the Atlantic. They couldn't know, that their factories and farms and mines represented military power greater than any army Germany could field. The official report that Schneider delivered to the Air Ministry upon his return was comprehensive, technical, and deeply troubling. He documented Boeing's production rates, analyzed their assembly line methodology, calculated the potential scale-up of American aircraft manufacturing in wartime conditions. He estimated that the United States could produce 15,000 military aircraft per year if fully mobilized, a number that exceeded the entire German aviation industry's peacetime capacity by a factor of 10. His colleagues submitted similar assessments, each focusing on different aspects of American industrial capability, but all reaching the same fundamental conclusion. America possessed latent military-industrial power that Germany could not match. The report circulated through the Luftwaffe's command structure during the winter of 1938 and 39. Reactions varied. Some officers dismissed Schneider's estimates as exaggerated, influenced by American propaganda. Others argued that German technical superiority and tactical doctrine would overcome any numerical disadvantage. A few, including some members of the General Staff, recognized the implications but felt powerless to alter the Führer's strategic course. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, reportedly read the assessment with growing irritation before declaring that American industrial capacity was irrelevant since the United States would never enter a European war. Schneider requested another meeting with his superiors in February 1939. He wanted to emphasize certain points that might have been lost in the technical details of his written report. The Americans are not preparing for war, he explained to a room of skeptical officers. But they are building an economy that can be converted to war production with devastating speed. Every automobile factory is a potential tank plant. Every aircraft manufacturer can scale up production tenfold. Every American worker represents a potential munitions worker, and they have 130 million citizens compared to our 80 million. But surely, one colonel interrupted, German organization and efficiency would counterbalance American numbers. Our workers are better trained, our engineers more experienced, our military traditions stronger. Schneider shook his head. You misunderstand what I saw. American production doesn't rely on skilled workers or long traditions. They've systematized the process. They've reduced complex manufacturing to simple, repeatable steps that anyone can learn. They can train a farm girl to build aircraft components in 6 weeks. Where would we find that capability? Our system depends on craftsmen who require years of apprenticeship. Their system depends on ordinary people following precise instructions. The meeting ended inconclusively. Germany was already committed to its course. The Luftwaffe expanded rapidly through 1939, absorbing resources and manpower as Hitler prepared for the confrontations to come. In September, German forces invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but the fighting remained limited during the phony war winter. The Luftwaffe demonstrated its effectiveness during the Norwegian campaign in April 1940, then proved decisive during the conquest of France in May and June. German aircraft dominated the skies over Europe, sweeping aside French and British opposition with tactical brilliance and technical superiority. Schneider flew reconnaissance missions during the French campaign, observing the destruction from above, burning cities, columns of refugees, shattered armies in retreat. The speed of Germany's victory seemed to vindicate those who had dismissed concerns about American industrial potential. France fell in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, isolated on its island, while the Luftwaffe prepared for the aerial campaign that would force British surrender. The worries of 1938 seemed almost absurd now, paranoid fantasies unsupported by the reality of German military dominance. But Schneider remembered Seattle. He remembered the B-17s rolling off the assembly line every 90 minutes. And he paid attention to intelligence reports from the United States, reports that most Luftwaffe officers ignored. American aircraft production was increasing. Boeing had expanded Plant 2 and opened new facilities. Douglas, Lockheed, and Consolidated were hiring thousands of workers. The U.S. Army Air Corps was ordering bombers in quantities that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. America wasn't at war, not yet, but its industrial machinery was stirring to life. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and dragged through the autumn. The Luftwaffe attacked British airfields, radar stations, and eventually cities, trying to destroy the Royal Air Force and break British morale, but Fighter Command held on and German losses mounted. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters proved roughly equal to British Spitfires, but the Luftwaffe couldn't replace its losses as quickly as the British could. German aircraft production increased, but the industrial base remained constrained by shortages of raw materials, skilled workers, and manufacturing capacity. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American factories were learning to build warplanes at unprecedented rates. In December 1940, President Roosevelt gave his Arsenal of Democracy speech, declaring that the United States would provide Britain with unlimited material support. American factories would supply the weapons that Britain needed to survive. Lend-Lease legislation followed in March 1941, formalizing the arrangement. Now American production capacity would directly support Britain's war effort, and those production numbers were becoming harder to dismiss as propaganda. Boeing delivered over 500 B-17s during 1941, exceeding even Schneider's optimistic estimates from 3 years earlier. And that was just one aircraft type from one manufacturer. Schneider received promotion to lieutenant colonel in April 1941 and a posting to the Air Ministry's Intelligence Division. His expertise in American aviation industry made him valuable for assessing enemy capabilities as the war expanded. He prepared reports on British aircraft production, analyzing factories and output rates. But his mind kept returning to the larger question: what would happen when American production fully mobilized for war? The answer began emerging in December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler. In a decision that Schneider considered catastrophic, declared war on the United States 4 days later. Now America was fully committed, and its industrial resources would be directed entirely toward military production. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and Schneider knew from personal experience what that giant could accomplish when roused. American aircraft production statistics for 1942 arrived at the Air Ministry through neutral channels and intelligence sources. The numbers seemed impossible. Over 47,000 military aircraft completed in a single year. Boeing produced hundreds of B-17s every month. The new B-24 Liberator, built by Consolidated and later by Ford's massive Willow Run plant, entered production at even higher rates. Douglas delivered thousands of transport aircraft. North American's P-51 Mustang fighter began rolling off assembly lines in Texas and California. American factories operated around the clock 7 days a week, employing millions of workers who produced not just aircraft, but engines, propellers, instruments, armaments, and every component necessary to wage industrial warfare. Schneider compiled these statistics into reports that circulated through the Luftwaffe command structure, but he sensed the futility of his efforts. The numbers were too large, too disconnected from German experience, to be fully comprehended by officers who had never witnessed American industry firsthand. How could you explain to someone who had never seen Boeing's Seattle plant that the Americans would eventually produce 300,000 military aircraft during the war? How could you make them understand that American factories would manufacture bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down? By 1943, the implications were becoming visible in the skies over Germany itself. American bomber formations, first B-17s, later joined by B-24s, appeared over German cities in groups that grew larger with each passing month. The 8th Air Force, operating from British bases, flew deep into German territory despite heavy losses. Luftwaffe fighters shot down dozens of bombers during each raid, but the Americans kept coming, replacing their losses within days, sometimes within hours. The industrial system that Schneider had witnessed in Seattle was now producing aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. German pilots reported the surreal experience of shooting down 3 or 4 American bombers during a single mission, only to face larger formations the following week. One fighter pilot, a captain who had flown since the Battle of France, told Schneider during a Berlin meeting, "We can win every battle and still lose the war. I've shot down 11 B-17s personally, but there are always more. Where do they all come from?" Schneider didn't need to answer. He knew where they came from. They came from Seattle, from Long Beach, from Fort Worth, from dozens of factories scattered across the American continent. They came from an industrial system designed for unlimited production, built by a nation whose manufacturing capacity exceeded the combined output of all European powers. They came, ultimately, from the same assembly lines he had watched in October 1938, when B-17s rolled off the production floor every 90 minutes, and he understood, in a moment of terrible clarity, that Germany had already lost. The bombing intensified through 1944. American daylight raids combined with British nighttime attacks to create around-the-clock pressure on German cities and industry. The Luftwaffe fought desperately, introducing new fighter tactics and aircraft designs, but nothing could stem the tide of Allied air power. German aircraft production actually increased during 1944, reaching remarkable levels despite constant bombing, but it couldn't keep pace with American output. For every German fighter built, the Americans produced 5 bombers. For every pilot Germany trained, the United States graduated 10. Schneider spent the final years of the war documenting the progressive destruction of German aviation industry, watching as the bombing campaign systematically dismantled the factories, supply chains, and infrastructure that supported the Luftwaffe. Ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, aluminum smelters, aircraft assembly lines. Each target represented a component of Germany's industrial base, and each bombing raid removed another piece until the entire system collapsed. By early 1945, German fighter production had effectively ceased. The Luftwaffe grounded most of its aircraft for lack of fuel. The skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies, whose aircraft appeared in formations so large they darkened the sky. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Schneider, by then a colonel, was captured by American forces in Bavaria. He spent several months in prisoner-of-war camps before his knowledge of aviation industry and his documented reports about American manufacturing capacity brought him to the attention of Allied intelligence officers. They interviewed him extensively, curious about what German leadership had known regarding American industrial potential and why they had chosen to ignore the warnings. "We knew," Schneider told his American interrogators. "At least some of us knew. I wrote reports, I gave presentations. I explained exactly what I had seen in Seattle and Chicago. But knowing and accepting are different things. How do you tell the Führer that he's leading the nation to inevitable defeat? How do you convince military leaders who've won every campaign that their victories are temporary, that mathematics and manufacturing capacity will eventually overcome tactical brilliance?" One American officer, a major who had served with the 8th Air Force, showed Schneider the final production statistics. The United States had manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft during the war years. Boeing alone produced 12,731 B-17s. The Ford Willow Run plant, built specifically for B-24 production, turned out one bomber every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. American factories had built more aircraft in 1944 than Germany produced during the entire war. The numbers Schneider had predicted in his 1938 report had been conservative. Reality exceeded even his most pessimistic estimates. "Did you know it would be this bad?" the major asked. Schneider nodded slowly. "I knew it would be impossible," he said. "I understood that America could build weapons faster than we could destroy them. But I hoped, we all hoped, that the war would end before American industry fully mobilized. We hoped for political settlement, for British surrender, for Soviet collapse. We hoped that military skill and tactical innovation could offset material disadvantage." He paused, looking at the production statistics spread across the table. "We were wrong. In modern warfare, industrial capacity is military power. Everything else, training, tactics, equipment quality, becomes irrelevant when one side can produce 10 times as many weapons as the other." The major considered this. "Your report from 1938.
I've read it. You were right about almost everything. Production rates, scalability, the conversion of civilian industry to military manufacturing. You warned your government.
Why didn't they listen? Because the alternative was unthinkable, Schneider replied. If we accepted my conclusions, then we had to accept that war with America was unwinnable. And if war with America was unwinnable, then our entire strategic position was untenable. Britain would never surrender while American support remained available. The Soviet Union could endure German attacks while receiving American supplies. Every calculation depended on keeping America neutral, or at least minimizing American involvement. My report suggested that American power was so overwhelming that these calculations were fantasy. No one wanted to hear that message. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.